Okay, going back to the main part of the book. If all of what I say be true, then this should help us to understand why the apostles in Jerusalem were still baptizing people in water. For they, as Jesus had pointed out, were to sit on 12 thrones and judge the 12 tribes of Israel, as we see in Matthew 19:28 and Luke 22:30. Meaning specifically that they were to pick up where Jesus had left off, Matthew 15:24, and actually close out that Old Testament era, John 4:35. Because as it is written, Peter and his friends were apostles to the Jews, the circumcised. But Paul had a different commission, was an apostle to the Gentiles, the uncircumcised. Galatians 2, verses 7 through 8. It was not therefore necessary for the apostles in Jerusalem to know the truth about water baptism for their ministry, for its demise had nothing to do with their own time and dispensation, no more than we could say that the tabernacle in the wilderness was wrong for Moses to build, or that the temple was wrong for Solomon to build, etc. Because God advances in time and dispensations. But just because it was good for people in certain time eras to do things commissioned by God, it does not mean that we should keep doing all of them forever simply because God was in it at one time and had blessed it at one time. What am I trying to say here? I am asking that since God was heavily into the tabernacle in the wilderness, do we need to rebuild one today for ourselves? Because God was into animal sacrifices at one time, should we begin sacrificing animals again today? In other words, just because God was ordaining and justifying things in the Old Testament world, or even as we are specifically speaking of in this chapter, during that overlapping transitional period, does that mean that we're supposed to do them forever? Just because it was good to do natural, ritualistic things in the Old Testament, then should we try and justify them for ourselves today? Or does God advance and move on to greater things? Let's go to Hebrews chapter 9, verse 11. Christ being come a high priest of good things to come, by a greater and a more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is to say, not of this building. Let's go to verses 13 through 14. For if the blood of bulls and of goats and the ashes of a heifer sprinkling the unclean sanctifies to the purifying of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit had offered himself without spot to God, purge your conscience from dead works to serve the living God? Verses 23 through 24. It was therefore necessary that the patterns of things in the heavens should be purified with these rituals. But the heavenly things themselves, the real things, are with better sacrifices than those old ones. For Christ has not entered into the holy places made with man's hands, which are all only figures of the true. But he went into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. Chapter 10, verse 1. For the law having a shadow of good things to come, but not the very image of the things, can never, with all those sacrifices that they offered year by year continually, make the comers thereunto perfect. Now, this is no different with the water baptism and communion practices today. Again, I contend that they were commissioned by God, but that they both were commissioned during the Old Testament. Even though it was near the end of the Old Testament, just prior to Jesus' death on the cross, and prior to the day of Pentecost. Therefore, and in conclusion, we should rather say that these two supposed New Testament rituals were commissioned for that transitional overlapping period of the Jerusalem apostles, having absolutely nothing to do with either Paul's commission, the Gentile converts, or even for any Christian, whether Jew or Gentile, post AD 70, past it. So the date of AD 70, just after the temple fell, had completed the closing out period of all Old Testament things, even the dispensation and ministry of the Jerusalem apostles. Jesus himself had declared that by the time the Roman army would advance upon Jerusalem, again, which concluded in AD 70, all things written would actually be fulfilled. For effect, let's see this once more. Luke 21, verses 20 through 22, this is Jesus talking. When you shall see Jerusalem compassed about with armies of Rome, which besieging again ended in AD 70, of that city that is, then know that the desolation, pagan symbols of Rome, therefore is near. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and to Perea called Pella, as we saw Eusebius speak about in the last explanatory note, and of which town I will explore again very soon. And let them which are in the midst of it depart out, and let not them that are in the countries enter thereinto. For these be the days of vengeance, that all things written, which are written, may be fulfilled. But what does that really mean? All things written would be fulfilled. Does that mean the whole Bible is now over with? No. First of all, it did concern all of what was written concerning the coming ultimate judgment against Israel. But two, it also meant anything that smacks of the natural, especially the carnal ordinances, would be at an utter end. And ordinances which actually remain for folks after AD 70 would only be observed and practiced spiritually, inside of us, as opposed to that which is done in the natural on the outside of us. That is, all those practices, including water baptism and the communion, that merely represent things of the spiritual, but now have to be performed on the inside of us rather than naturally on the outside. Let's face it, the kingdom of God itself isn't natural anymore either, nor even found at a natural location. For if it were natural, then the natural practices would still stand. Let's go to Luke 17, verses 20c through 21, and this is Jesus talking. The kingdom of God comes not with observation, can't be physically seen. Neither shall they say, lo, it's over here, or lo, it's over there. It's not at a physical, geographical location. For behold, the kingdom of God is within you. It's inside of us. And with that, there is another explanatory note. This brief explanatory note is called It's Inside of Us. Now herein I will only stick to one aspect of the teaching of God's kingdom, of which one may want to call the spiritual side of it. Again, to go ahead and to speak of the future kingdom and with the justice that needs to be done with it, that is to get into extreme detail, would take up just too much room. In fact, the last 3 books that I have published on Christian theology, 2 commentaries on both the Gospel of John and the Epistle of Romans, and my book, Satan, the Devil, and Hell, had swollen to the size of near 600 pages of text apiece. And I simply do not want to weary my audience with too much text at a given time. Therefore, I had to convince myself herein to simply stay with the current subject as much as possible on the ending of Carnal Ordinances, and to leave both the subject of the future kingdom of God and also of Jesus' second advent return for another time, for another subject, for another book or books. Now, I certainly apologize for that last-minute decision, but it's all for the best and for the sake of having a normal-sized book this time. And I'm going to try to publish those latter thoughts along with many other subjects that are lingering on the waiting list for me to complete just as soon as I possibly can. In the meantime, you will definitely see me come close to those subjects anyway within the following pages of this book, but they will immediately be followed up by a reminder of what I have just said in this current explanatory note, and even perhaps with a detour back to this note for further clarity. Okay, let's go back to the main part of the book now.